Well, you may have heard testimonies of Christians turning to Christ or atheists turning to Christ when they are on their deathbed, when they hit rock bottom, when people go through traumatic, life-changing, life-altering experiences. It is at those moments then they turn to Jesus and start to follow him. And so the question is, what does this mean for the truth of Christianity? What does this mean for others and what they should or should not do? And this is exactly what our atheist Armin Navabi addresses in chapter 18 of his book, Why There Is No God. Let's see, where is it? Right there. There's the book title again, Why There Is No God, Simple Responses to 20 Common Arguments for the Existence of God. And in chapter 18, what today's show is going to be about is addressing this comment, you'll become a believer when you are desperate for God's help. And so the idea here is that when you become desperate enough, when you need God enough, that is when people turn to God. And we're going to look at Armin Navabi's responses. So that's going to be the show today. I'm looking forward to a fun one. As always, I'm going to be taking your calls and your questions. So you can start to get in the queue. You can click on the link in the live chat on YouTube, get in the queue for callers, as well as you can put in a question into the live chat, whether on Instagram or YouTube. Place a Q before your question. That way I can find it as I scroll through everything that's been commented there. And as we jump in, let me just say this. You may be clicking on this show thinking, well, hold on a second, Ryan. Last week you said you were going to be doing a show on the origin of humanity, looking at a scientific account for Adam and Eve. And the answer is yes, that was the plan until there was a conflict of schedule and that show had to be rescheduled. So we're still finding an exact date on when that will be. Hopefully it will be in December before the year's end. But that one is going to have to be rescheduled, which is why we're here talking about chapter 18. Almost done with this book, 20 chapters long. Chapter 18, only 2 more shows left. So that's going to be the topic today. And by the way, my name is Ryan Pauly. This is the show Think Well, the show that exists to try to train you to think well about the Christian faith as well as the culture, to think about objections and arguments against the Christian faith so that you can learn how to better explain your views and have conversations on this. So whether it's an atheist, hopefully you hear a different maybe Christian response than you've heard before. Maybe you're a Christian and you're hearing atheist objections that you haven't heard before. Either way, hopefully no matter who you are or who is listening, this is beneficial and thinking through how to have better conversations about the truth of Christianity and the existence of God. And let me just say before we jump in as well, if you are in the Southern California area coming up in February, we are going to be having the Maven Conference here in Southern California, February 22nd. It's a one-day all day long conference. You can see there on the bottom speakers, Brett Kunkel, Aaron Rain, Doug Axe, Magneto Son, myself, Thaddeus Williams, and Krista Bontrager are going to be there addressing this theme of truth and courage. And really, how do Christians stand firm for the truth and courageously in a culture that is maybe not the most favorable towards Christianity? And how do we live this kind of countercultural lifestyle? And so I'm going to be actually speaking in the youth track. And so during breakout sessions, there's different tracks that they're going to have, a theology track, a parent track, a youth track, geared towards different individuals. And I'm going to be speaking in the youth track on how to live for Christ in an immoral world, on how do we look at the examples of the early church, as well as the example of Daniel living in Babylonian culture and standing strong for what we believe, but doing so in a way that builds bridges that people are willing to cross, a way that is an example that people look to and go, wow, that's really cool. That's amazing. That's attractive. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about. So again, February 22nd, if you want more information, you can go to mavenconferences.com and get more information there. So let me just post this over here, and then we're going to jump into the show today. Copy and paste this here. All right. So chapter 18 in Armin's book is addressing, as I mentioned, this comment that you'll become a believer when you are desperate for God's help. And so he makes the, I don't know what just happened over there on Instagram, but hopefully it's still streaming. Okay. He makes this idea of that conventional wisdom of many believers is that atheists frequently find themselves pulling towards God during times of stress or times of difficulty or at life's end. And he kind of makes these comments, and I've heard these before, of, there are no atheists in foxholes, that when you're in the middle of a battle and bombs are dropping and bullets are whizzing by your head, there's no one there who's an atheist. Everyone is crying out to God in that moment. The other comment that he addresses here is only an atheist until the plane starts to fall. And so it's like, his idea here is that life is good. And when life is going well, it's easy to be an atheist. But once you experience hard times, then people turn to a belief in God. And so maybe that's what you need in life. Maybe you just need some hard times. Maybe that's what it's going to take for your eyes to open and to believe in God. And so that is kind of the thought process or the argument there that Armin is addressing. Now, let me just say from the beginning, this is not an argument for God's existence. That's why, again, I feel like some of these, the subtitle of this book and really the title of the book in general is somewhat deceptive. Armin titles his book, and I can pull it up here again if you want to see it. He titles his book, Why There Is No God, as if this made me at least believe that he's going to present evidence why there's no God. Here's why there's no God. However, Armin takes a very common kind of atheist definition of atheism, that atheism is just a lack of belief. And so if you're simply lacking a belief in God, then you're not giving positive evidence or arguments for your lack of belief. You're just saying, well, I find the evidence that is being presented unconvincing. And so I'm just not convinced of your arguments. And so I lack that belief. And so it's interesting, I think, to title a book, Why There Is No God, as if you're going to present some evidence for, and then really you are more taking the definition, or the common definition of lacking a belief in God. Now, then the subtitle, Simple Responses to 20 Common Arguments for the Existence of God. This one, I think, is not an argument for God, as some of the other chapters that we've looked at are not arguments for God. It's things that Christians say. And the question is, are they said for good reason? But this by no means is proof or evidence for God's existence. This isn't an argument for God. This is just a reality of what takes place in some people's lives. And so I get he's trying to respond to that, but it's not really an argument for God. And so he addresses that from the get-go. And I just want to say I agree with Armin here. This is not an argument. He says, while this claim may be true for some people, it's certainly not a universal truth claim among atheists. Moreover, the existence of deathbed conversions and similar experiences do not prove the existence of God. And I would agree, these sort of experiences do not prove that God is real. Now, what's interesting is here at the very beginning, this is, I think, is the closest he comes to kind of acknowledging the reality of what the Christian is addressing, but then he doesn't really come back to it the rest of the chapter. He says, while this claim may be true for some people, that they are rejecting God until they are desperate for his help and then they turn to God, he goes, well, that may be true of some people. It's certainly not a universal truth claim among all atheists. Now, I've never heard, I don't know of every Christian. I'm sure Christians have probably said this, but I've never heard a Christian say that this is a universal truth claim that is true for all people at all times and all places, that all atheists, when they are desperate for God's help, they will turn to him. I've never heard that made. And so if we are trying to make this as some sort of universal claim that every single atheist will become a Christian during a time of stress, well, that's just simply not true. It's not a universal claim, but the fact is that some people have this experience, that there are some where when they hit rock bottom, when they are desperate and in need of God's help, they turn to a relationship in God. The issue here is that unless I missed it, Armin never addresses that sort of person the entire rest of the chapter. Instead, what he does is kind of criticize that view, show how it's irrational, and then give examples of atheists who have not had deathbed conversions. So he goes on to say, they only suggest that people are at their most irrational when frightened, in pain, or delirious. So he's saying, look, if this is true, if there are people who, when desperate for God's help, turn to God, he says all this shows is that people are at their most irrational when frightened, in pain, or delirious. So when you are frightened, in pain, delirious, when you've hit rock bottom, all this shows is that you become irrational. Now notice here, because I think this is going to drive the argument through the entire rest of Armin's chapter. Notice how Armin is assuming his view is true and then going on to show how all of these examples or stories are irrational, are ridiculous, are irrelevant. Well, they're only irrational and irrelevant if you assume your narrative of Christianity and God being false as the truth. This chapter, I did not find a single argument against God or a refutation of the Christian explanation of what is taking place here. All I saw was Armin saying, look, these are irrational. And it's starting, well, yes, it's irrational if there is no God. If Christianity is false, it is irrational. But that's the very question that we're asking is it irrational? Is Christianity true? That's the question that Armin is supposed to be responding to, rather than assuming his view is true and then calling the Christian response irrational. And so a different narrative, right? You could say, as he will go on to say, okay, look, it's irrational because we do ridiculous things when we are in pain, or when we are in desperation, when we are frightened, when we are delirious, we do crazy things. That's true. But sometimes pain makes us do rational, reasonable things. So think about this. I've shared this story before on the show. There was one time when I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic, I woke up with stomach pain and I went, no big deal. This is nothing deal. I can handle this myself. I'll deal with this myself. I'm probably just hungry. So I went and ate some breakfast and my pain didn't go away. And I thought, no big deal. I can, take some Tylenol or whatever. I can just go back to bed. I can lay in bed. The pain's going to go away. And it didn't go away. And it wasn't until the pain continued and continued and continued, and I had tried every possible way on my own to fix this problem, that I finally cried out to my roommate, please take me to the hospital. I need to go to a hospital. Now, would you say that I was being irrational in that pain, when delirious, when frightened, that I was now making an irrational decision by crying out for someone else to help me? By no means. Because you would actually say I was being irrational by not crying out to help, because the pain that I had was a real pain. I was experiencing an actual problem with my body, and that is a problem that I can't fix myself, that I could not have dealt with myself. And so to try to think I can cure my own problem, I can fix my own issue, is irrational when the issue you're trying to fix is not something that you can actually fix. Instead, it took that level of pain to convince me, Ryan, you don't know what you're doing. You can't fix this problem. You need someone else. And I went to the hospital. Turns out I had appendicitis and I had to be taken into surgery, have my appendix removed before my pain was gone. So here's an example, and I'm not saying therefore God exists or anything. I'm just saying there's two very different ways to narrate the experience that people have. You can say, yes, in pain and delirious and frightened, do people make irrational things? Yes, some people do make irrational decisions when they are delirious in pain. But other people, their pain actually causes them to make the right decision. The question is the pain real? Is that thing real, and can you fix it yourself? And I think this is the big argument that Christians are making, is that, look, we sometimes are stubborn. We sometimes are hard-headed, and we sometimes think we can do everything on our own and we don't need anybody's help. That is a true reality of humans. I got this almost every single year in my high school class, where high schoolers would come in and be like, I don't need anyone's help for anything. I can do this all on my own. And I would just laugh at this in a sense, right? It's like, oh, really? So you paved the roads that you drove to school on, and you designed and built the car that you drove in, and you built the chair that you're sitting on, and you programmed the computer that you're using, and you built the bed that you slept in and the house that you slept in, and you grew the food that you cooked? Of course not. We need everyone else to work together to pretty much do anything in life. It's like we can walk and breathe and, digest food on our own, and that's about it. We need other people. And so there's a reality that we sometimes have to recognize, is that we're not in a world all by ourselves, or we just do our own thing and we don't involve anybody else. We have to sometimes be broken of that idea and recognize, no, you need other people at times for other stuff, right? We recognize as well, I had a high school student once that would just go off and sleep in his car during class, and he would ditch things and just always be gone. And I remember one time him not showing up to something he was supposed to be at, and I went and I found him asleep in his car. And I remember just, he got detention after detention and all the different ways that we tried to punish him to get him to wake up and realize you can't do this. And I remember specifically walking him back to his class and saying to him, look, all of this that we're doing is to try to get you to wake up and realize that you can't keep living this way. That you're going to get to college and do this, and you're just going to get expelled, or you're going to get to a job and do this, and you're just going to get fired. And at that point, you're going to have a wife or kids, or you're going to have someone that you're going to have to provide for. And how are you going to provide if you don't have a job? We're trying to get you to wake up and realize this way of living and just doing whatever you want to do, whenever you want to do it, is not the way to live. And you have to learn responsibility, and you have to learn to do the things that you're supposed to do. I said to him, but my fear is it's going to take you hitting rock bottom. It's going to take you getting, kicked out of university or fired from a job before you kind of wake up and realize, oh my goodness, I've been acting foolishly. I can't keep doing this. Now, luckily, he actually did change his way of living before that rock bottom moment happened. But I think that's a realization. That's something I said to him. And I think that's just true of us. And so the thing that Christians are trying to address here is to say, look, there are times where people say, look, I don't need God. I can do this on my own. I can figure this out myself. And we do that in every area of our lives. And often it's not until we fail, or we're about to fail, or we realize we're going to fail, or something terrible happens to where we finally go, oh my goodness, I can't do this on myself. I need some help. And we cry out for that help. And so all that I think Christians are trying to say here is that is a realization for some, right? C.S. Lewis, talked about, I wish I had the quote pulled up, but he talked about, God whispers in our lives in the goodness, but he shouts in our pains. He says, pain is God's megaphone to a broken world. Right? When your body is healthy, you never think of a doctor. But when stuff starts to hurt, then all of a sudden you start thinking of doctors, because when everything's going well, why would I go over here? Like, why would I go to a checkup? It's like some people are really good about that. Their yearly checkups and yearly screenings and everything. Other people are like, hey, if I feel good, why would I go? I think that's what this is trying to get to. And so when you think about it in that sense, is it only suggesting, is the fact that some people turn to God when they are in need of help, does that, as Armin says here, quote, only suggest that people are at their most irrational when frightened, in pain, or delirious? I don't think so. I think sometimes pain and hitting rock bottom actually is a wake-up call for some to realize, look, you thought you were in control and you're not. You thought you could do this on your own and you can't. You actually need help. Now, is this proof of God? By no means. This isn't proof that there's actually a God, but that's what it's trying to say, I think, in short for this conversation. Now, Armin says the intense fear of death may drive some to accept illogical or irrational views out of desperation for comfort or a way to relieve or lessen their intense anxiety. Absolutely true. It is true that an intense fear of death may drive some to accept irrational or illogical views. That is true. But I think a fear of death may drive some to accept rational and logical views, right? A desperation may drive people to an appropriate answer for their need. And sometimes a desperation drives people to an inappropriate answer for their need. I don't think the fact that you are in desperation or have a fear of death means it's always illogical, irrational, or turning to something unreasonable. He says here, the idea that fear could drive you towards a belief in God only goes to suggest that religious claims are commonly fear-based and not rooted in actual logic or evidence. I don't know how Armin here jumps to this conclusion. The idea that fear could drive you towards belief in God only suggests that religious claims are commonly fear-based. Again, think about my doctor example. Is the fear that you could die because you're in such extreme pain and that fear driving you to go to a hospital, but show that the claim that you need to go to a hospital is only a fear-based claim? No, of course not. It's the fact that sometimes I think we are hard-headed or stubborn and we think we can always do it on our own. And we don't want to go to hospitals. We don't like hospitals. We don't like sitting there. We think, hey, if I can figure this out myself, if I can take the right combination of over-the-counter medicines, I'm going to be fine, until ultimately we have that deep fear and that overcomes our hatred of going to hospitals, maybe, that we finally go. But does that mean that people suggesting and claiming, hey, you should go to the hospital, that it's only a fear-based view, not rooted in actual logic or evidence? By no means. The question is, what logic or evidence has also been presented? I think that's the big question, is, has there ever been logic or evidence presented? And as we've walked through the previous 17 parts in this series, there are times that I have presented logic and evidence to support the Christian view. And so when we say to someone, look, here's why you should go to the hospital. You have this problem. This problem cannot be solved by taking Tylenol. Only a doctor can solve this problem. And you give all the evidence and you supply the studies. And here's a study and here's a study. And they go, no, No, I think I can fix this myself. I think if I just take the right, tea, then I'll be okay. If I just get the right amount of sleep, if I just do this, then I'll be okay. And it isn't till all of those ways have failed, that they are in extreme pain, that they are finally driven to go to the hospital, would you then say, see, this is only fear-based and not rooted in actual evidence or logic? It's like, well, no, we tried the logic and evidence, and the person just brushed it off, explained it away, completely dismissed it because they thought they could do it on their own. And sometimes, not always, but for some, and this is the testimony of some, that it took that life-breaking moment to finally change their mind and say, okay, I will ask for help. And so for Armin, he says, unintentionally theists are essentially acknowledging that their claims are irrational. I don't think so at all. By me saying some people need a desperation moment to turn to God does not mean that is the only reason to believe in God and therefore it's irrational. I'm just saying that we have bias, right? Atheists, I think, should and almost always do acknowledge this because they claim that Christian is bias. We have bias that causes us to not see things clearly that go against what we want to be true. We have a desirability bias, what we want to be true. We have confirmation bias, where we only look for things that confirm the things that we believe are true. I think almost everyone does this, or we are prone to do this, or we could do this. No certain group is immune from doing this. Again, I shared the story of talking to an atheist who was asked by an atheist club to give a presentation. An atheist club asked an atheist to give a presentation. The atheist said, sure, I'll give a presentation. It's going to be about how not everything you believe is true. And the atheist club said, no, we're not interested. We don't want to hear you tell us how we might have false ideas because we are people who stand by the truth. Like, that is a confirmation bias in the opposite of, I don't want to hear anything that may show that actually I believe something false. We all have the ability, and I'm not saying all atheists do this. I'm not saying all Christians don't do this. It's that we all have the ability to do this. And so we recognize that we may dismiss the rational arguments and evidence based on what we want to be true. And then often there's it could be that a life experience then causes us to overcome that and choose a different option. So he goes on and says, are there really no atheists in foxholes? And he says, well, many atheists lose their faith through reasonable discourse and careful consideration. True. Many Christians look at the evidence and walk away and become atheists because of the evidence. Well, in the same way, many atheists have become Christians because they look at the evidence and have become Christians because of the evidence and the reason involved. And so the fact that a Christian loses their faith, or the fact that an atheist gains faith, is not proof that God is real or not. The question is, what evidence has convinced you away from God, or what evidence has convinced you towards God? We need to look at the claims that they're actually making and the evidence that they're using to support those claims, not simply showing that some atheists have lost their faith and some atheists have gained faith. That is not the thing. And so then he points to Carl Sagan, he points to Richard Dawkins, and he points to Christopher Hitchens, who all made the claims that they will never have a deathbed conversion. And in fact, if someone claimed that they had a deathbed conversion after their death, that it needs to be dismissed because there's no reason whatsoever that they would have a deathbed conversion. And so Armin uses this as an example of, well, are there really no atheists in foxholes? Well, no, here's three atheists, Carl Sagan, Christopher Hitchens, and Richard Dawkins, that are saying, even at the worst part of my life, on my deathbed, I will not convert. And so he used that, say, see, there really are there are some atheists in foxholes. And there's an example. And it's like, well, yes, because it's not a universal claim. And I don't think anyone's claiming it's universal that every single atheist becomes a Christian on their deathbed. That's clearly not true. The question is, do some? And I think the answer is yes, because that's the testimony of individuals who claim to have put their faith in Jesus because of hitting that rock bottom moment. Now, Armin, I think, is going to try to address this. And hi, everyone that's here. Hi, Travis and Jennifer and Jesse and Discerner and Hamobu. Good to see you all here. I'll jump over to live chat here shortly for questions. And again, if you want to call into the show, use the link that's posted there. And you can call in and get yourself in the queue. And again, often I might go a long time with my callers because no one else is in the queue and no one else is asking questions. So feel free, if you want to ask questions, just get yourself in the queue. And that way I know there's people that want to chat. So Armin's going to say, well, hey, yes, sure, some people maybe are faced with extreme stress or pain or whatever, are going to turn to Christ. However, The dying brain, he claims, cannot be trusted. He says, faced with extreme stress, pain, loss of blood, drugs, or other factors, the brain sometimes acts differently than it normally would. He then says about how people have had weird conspiracies. Hi, Slam. Weird conspiracies because of being on a deathbed and being stressed out or anxious and whatever. Then all of a sudden they kind of have these, weird hallucinations or whatever. True. And therefore, he concludes, religious myths are widespread and many people are exposed to religion from a young age. Such fables can easily resurface from the subconscious mind regardless of a person's conscious or rational beliefs. And so his argument here is that, look, when people are at this stressed out thing, you can't trust your brain in that moment. And I would say, well, look, there are times where, yes, what you do and what happens cannot be trusted. But there are other times where that stress or pain has led people to make rational, reasonable, and the right decisions. So we can't just use this example and say some people have hallucinations when stressed out, therefore you can't trust your brain. And it's like, well, what about these people that have good choices when they are stressed out? What about that? And you can never say, well, now you always can trust your brain. But again, it's saying, well, yeah, sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. The question is what's going on here and what evidence do we have to support the claim that they're claiming to believe? He goes, theists like to point to global prevalence of religious belief as proof that there is a global desire to believe in God. The reality is more complex. There's cultural indoctrination that plays a role. Well, sure, there's a lot of reasons and factors that play a role into why religion is so widespread. The question, though, is what about when the culture is against religion, when it's not just in cultural indoctrination? What about first century Christianity, where they're being persecuted and belief spreads quickly? What about the fact that their people claim that they believe in God because of experiences they've had with God? What about miracles that they've witnessed that God has done? And we've talked about this in other shows, and not that I'm claiming that all of these miracles are therefore true, but to simply say, well, hey, this is complex and there's cultural indoctrination at play. And therefore, the human brain likes to find patterns and random noises and search for explanations. Therefore, it can all be dismissed as indoctrination and the human brain searching for answers, I don't think is a reasonable response to what people are actually claiming. Right? When people are presenting other reasons for belief and the widespread of belief, to just simply say, well, hey, there's cultural indoctrination and the brain searches for noises and explanations. And we recognize that, therefore, we can just dismiss these claims. I think that's dismissing them in a blanket sense and not actually dealing with the claims that people have made. He says humans have a lot of natural impulses and tendencies, but that doesn't mean that we need to embrace them all. True, but we have to look at them. He goes, that we might have some desire to appeal to a higher deity says less about the reality of God than it does about the way our brains are wired and our natural human desires to understand the universe, regardless of whether such a perceived understanding is based on a verifiable evidence or an ancient dogma. And that's the whole point. And recognize, I'm saying here, I don't think that what he's presenting, what I said at the beginning, I don't think that what he presents is a refutation of the Christian view. As well as the Christian view is not necessarily evidence. Look, we have desires, right? This is C.S. Lewis' argument for desire. We have desires that do point to a reality. I am hungry, and that's a desire I have that points to the reality of food. I am thirsty, and that's a desire that points to the reality of water. There are desires that we have that do make a claim or say something about reality. And so there's C.S. Lewis thing of like, if we have desires for true justice and compassion and these sort of issues that cannot be satisfied by this life, does that point to another life that can satisfy them? I think to just dismiss them and say, well, hey, our desires to appeal to higher deity say less about the reality of that God than just how our brains are wired. It's like, well, that's possible. It doesn't prove that there's a God, but let's address the argument of how it is that our desires sometimes do point to a reality of something in the world, hunger and food. And so what do we do with other sort of desires when there are also not just these desires, but then there are evidence and arguments pointing to the reality of that God existing as well? And so we have to recognize that we want to look at evidence. We want to look at these claims and to just simply say, well, here are some atheists that did not believe at the end of their life. And here are some times in which your brain can act irrationally. Therefore, that's how we explain all these situations. And I would say, no, that's not a refutation. That's not an explanation. That doesn't actually discredit what is taking place here. And I think that's the big question is what Armin has presented. Is it a reason why there is no God? And I don't think it is. It is a response to this argument, but the question is, does it actually refute the argument that some people do hit rock bottom and believe in God? And he doesn't really address that at all. And so this is another example from a chapter in which I wish Armin would have addressed the claim that Christians are actually making, that sometimes we are prideful, arrogant, or just wanting to do things on our own. And that's not a problem. You say like, hey, I think I got this. I can do this. And it sometimes is only when we realize we can't and we fail that we ask for other people for help. And that's not irrational. That's making the right decision. And we do this all the time. He finishes the chapter the same way he's mentioned many chapters of belief does not influence reality. And he says, as we discussed time and time again, belief in something does not make it true. I agree. And so he then says, insisting that an atheist will convert on her deathbed or stating that a person's views will crumble in times of crisis is both patronizing and irrelevant. Well, I would say, yes, it's irrelevant in a sense to whether God does exist or not. It's showing what is happening to that person. But I think it's equally patronizing to say that any story of a person converting to Christianity because of a deathbed experience or because of some sort of pain or crisis in their life, and to say, well, that is completely irrational and unreasonable, I think is equally patronizing to say, well, yeah, of course, your brain does irresponsible and irrational things when in times of crisis. You're claiming that person is irresponsible and irrational. And so I think that's equally patronizing to just assume that this person in their time of crisis is not actually thinking rationally. We do that all the time. We think rationally in a time of crisis. It sometimes is a crisis that pushes us over the limit to actually make a choice. But to say, hey, in times of crisis that I just completely go, okay, whatever, I don't care. End of story. Let me just believe. Again, sure, that can be irrational. And do some people do that? Sure. But there are other people, I think, that it is that moment that actually causes them to think more deeply, consider an option they would not have considered before, and come to a different conclusion. And so I think it's equally patronizing, yes, to say all atheists will convert on their deathbed. And it's also equally patronizing to say all people who do convert are irrational and unreasonable, and proving that Christianity is not based on any sort of logic or evidence. He says, look, there's no shame. This is how he finishes. There's no shame in deathbed experiences or temporary reversions in times of crisis. People do not have control over what their brains do when under a state of duress. And it's hardly representative of their views if they do or say strange things when faced with death, illness, or tragedy. But using the behavior of a person made vulnerable by tragedy as an excuse to promote a religious agenda is utterly reprehensible. Look, this I think is a strange twist on what people are actually claiming. To use a person's behavior and what they to share the story of an individual who in the midst of tragedy found God, and to say, well, you're just using a vulnerable tragedy as an excuse to promote religious agenda. That's reprehensible. What about the person themselves that says, look, I was arrogant. I believed I could do it all on my own. I didn't think I needed God for anything. And it was when I hit rock bottom and realized I'm not in control of my life, I can't do this, that all of a sudden the things that had been told to me before came to mind about the evidence and reliability of God and the proof of God. And I recognized, okay, God, if you really are real based on these other things I've heard, I want to trust and believe in you. To then use that story and share that story as this is what's happened with someone, how is that utterly reprehensible? Again, I think that we can twist this narrative in different ways where you can make it look horrible, where I'm just using a vulnerable tragedy for my benefit. Or I can say, here's a reality of what someone has gone, showing the beauty of God and finding them in that tragic moment and saving them. Or here is someone coming to the realization of what is true in the midst of this tragedy. Like that is a beautiful thing that we can share. And I think it depends on how we want to look at this and how we want to frame it. And so, again, I find this very interesting. Again, it's not an argument for God. It's not proof that God is real, but it is the story of some individuals. And I think that this chapter is an example of how we can sometimes, and Christians can do this too, of how we can really twist how we frame someone's argument to make it look ridiculous and then be like, man, that's so ridiculous. And I don't think Armin actually addresses what people are claiming. And I think the true reality that we sometimes want to do things on our own until we realize we can't. It's only then that we ask for help. This isn't everybody, but it definitely does happen. So with that, let me jump over here to your questions. I see a lot that have come in the live chat, so I'm going to kind of go through those questions. Again, if you're watching on Instagram, if you have questions, put them in the live chat or use that link to call into the show. So let me scan back through here. All right. It's common for unscrupulous people to take advantage of the desperate. Do you agree with Christian miracle healers and prosperity preachers take advantage of the desperate? Yes, they do. Absolutely. I've seen this happen. I was in a room where this took place. And I've seen this happen, and I speak against this in many different ways. People absolutely take advantage of the desperate. However, I would say this is not what always takes place. Right? Just because a prosperity preacher can take advantage of a desperate person, claim that there's some healing if they give a bunch of money, and then the preacher skips town and that person is never healed. There's no way that you can call that person out. That would be taking advantage of the desperate, but we would never say a doctor takes advantage of the desperate, because actually what they're doing is providing true healing. Right? And so they're saying, look, you need a doctor, but that's not taking advantage. That's pointing to a true reality. And so while I would agree that there are people who do take advantage of the desperate, I don't think that's always the case. And again, I've even said this in other ways, where I was at a prayer service and someone on stage was like, I think I'm receiving a word from the Holy Spirit. And I believe the Holy Spirit is telling me there's someone in the audience. This is like a 200 person audience. There's someone in the audience who has a troubled relationship with their father. If that's you, we want to pray for you. And I sat there and went, are you kidding me? In 200 people, clearly there's someone here that has a troubled relationship with their father. Why not just say, hey, we want to pray for anyone here who has a broken relationship with their dad. If that's you and you want prayer, we want to pray for you. Why not say it that way? Why say, I feel like I'm receiving a word from the Holy Spirit that someone here has a troubled relationship with their father? I think that's over spiritualizing things. And making it seem like, wow, there's something super powerful happening. And I think that can be used to take advantage of people, that as if this person on the microphone is extra spiritual, getting some word from the Lord. When in reality, there's no way that we know if they're actually getting a word from the Lord, because also the thing that they're saying is super general. Now, if it was like, I'm receiving a word from the Lord, there is a person here named John who was born in California, who has X, Y, and Z happen, and you developed a pain in your knee 10 minutes ago and it just started hurting and you don't know why. I just made that up because it's like 10 minutes ago, they didn't have time to like tell someone to make it all the way up to the stage. Like now you're like, okay, that is very specific. And if there's a John that really is there that did develop that pain 10 minutes ago, like, okay, how did they know that? Right? That's more specific. But to say, I received a word from the Lord, there's someone here with a broken relationship with their dad, I think is not always taking advantage or manipulative, but I'm skeptical. Why not just say, hey, we want to pray for people who have broken relationships? So I think absolutely, while it's true at times, it's not always true. Desperate people turn to God, but also alternative medicine, psychics, and snake oils. Do you think that's rational? No. And that's why I agree with Armin, is that not everyone makes a rational decision when they are in a time of need. And there are times, and I agreed with him, that people make irrational decisions when they are in desperate times. That's absolutely true. The question is this, Hamobu, are decisions when in desperation always irrational? Or is it possible that they make a rational, reasonable decision in desperate times? And if they can make a rational decision in desperate times, then the question is, okay, what makes that a rational decision? And it's because the decision they make accurately reflects what is wrong with them, considers the evidence of how to fix that wrong, and they take appropriate measures. So again, if I have stomach pain and I thought, well, I just need to sleep some more, which is what I thought, that's not very rational, because wouldn't the sleep just fix stomach pain? But if I go, I need to go to the doctor, and they say, well, it's your appendix, we need to take you to surgery. Well, that's reasonable, because appendix does cause stomach pain, and taking an appendix out does fix that stomach pain. And so the question is, are people always desperate? are always irrational when they are in desperate times. And it seems like Armin is suggesting yes. And that's what I'm pushing out back against. I'm saying, well, yes, while that is true at times, it is not always true. And so the question is it ever rational or reasonable to turn to God in that time of desperation? And only if the instant, immediate answer is yes, of course that's irrational. That's only because the person is starting with the belief that there is no God, Christianity is false, and therefore to do that would be irrational and unreasonable. But that is the very question we're asking is, does God exist and is Christianity true? And so to presuppose an answer saying, no, God doesn't exist, Christianity is not true, therefore any Christian who does this is automatically irrational, or any believer or atheist who turns to Christianity in a desperate time is irrational or unreasonable, is only simply presupposing your view and then applying that presupposition onto the question. But that is the very question we're asking is this rational or reasonable? What evidence do we have? And so that's where I would say, yes, people do dumb things when in desperate times. That doesn't mean it's always that case. I don't see any callers here. If you want to join, if you want to call in the show, again, use that link that's in the live chat there pinned at the top on YouTube. I'm continuing to pawn through or to scroll through all of your questions. Let's see. Question. Here's another one. Have you ever considered the modern apologetic movement is based in the pride of relying on natural mental reasoning instead of openly admitting Christian beliefs come as a miracle in the heart? I have to read this again. Have I considered that the modern apologetic movement is based in the pride of relying on natural mental reasoning instead of openly admitting Christian belief come as a miracle in the heart? That's a really interesting question. I haven't considered it that way. So no, I haven't considered what you're saying here. Now, as I consider it, I don't think it's prideful to use our mind and to reason for belief. We see this in Scripture. We hear in Scripture to contend for the faith, to reason for the faith, to provide arguments and evidence, to give an apologetic, right? Apologia in 1 Peter 3:15, to always be ready to provide a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do so with gentleness and respect. We see Jesus giving reasons. We see Jesus doing miracles in the presence of people so that they would believe. And so I don't think that Scripture calls us to turn off our mind and to never give mental reasoning when there's a ton of verses. And I can pull some more of those verses up here in a second to actually, what is that then causes us to believe? Verses that show, hey, no, turn on your mind and consider these things when you believe. Now, Christian belief comes as a miracle in the heart. Yes, when you put your trust in God, when God comes and saves, that is a change of heart. That is a miracle in heart. The mere fact of salvation is not just because I believed right intellectual things. And so that is a miracle. When Jesus Christ saves us and redeems us and restores us, that is a miracle. That is not just because I had some sort of assent to proper truth claims. The issue, though, is that faith has an intellectual component. Faith is intellectual, emotional, and volitional, that we have to believe right things about God. If I don't believe that Jesus is God, if I do not confess that God raised Christ from the dead, then I'm not going to be saved. Then there is no Christian belief or any change of heart if I do not believe the right things. And so to confess with my mouth and believe in the heart that Jesus is Lord and that God raised him from the dead, I actually have to believe that Jesus is Lord and that God raised him from the dead. And so is an intellectual component to our beliefs. There's also an emotional component, right? The devil and Satan and his angels, like they believe true things about God, yet they believe and they shudder. Christians are called to believe in love. So the devil believes that there's a God. Does that mean that he follows God? Of course not. Right? And then there's the volitional, where you choose to follow God in the midst of it. And so we recognize that faith is intellectual, but it is also emotional and volitional. And so there is a sense in which believing right things, it's not just a prideful thing. I'm not just saying, oh yes, I believed all the right things and now Jesus has to save me. There is still I submit that there's, Ephesians 2:8 and 9. For you're saved by faith, not of works, so that no one may boast. It's not because I did the right works or believe the right things and I can now post and be prideful of, look at me, I did all this right stuff and now I had this change of heart. Yes, there is a true change of heart, but I don't think the modern apologetics movement is based on pride or relying on natural mental reasoning instead of a faith in God. It's saying, hey, we can reason because God told us to reason and he gave us the mind to reason, but there still is a component that is outside of our control where God chooses to save. So I would be interested you continue here. And that Christians don't want to look dumb to unbelievers or admit things they don't understand. And so apologetics kind of feeds on a smug, I'm smarter than atheist attitude over humility. I'm curious if atheists listening sense this from apologists or from me. I try to admit when I don't know something. When questions are asked, I was just asked a question last night. Someone was at a Q&A last night and someone asked me a question. I went, I don't even know what word you just used. What is that word? And they said it again. They said, what's your view on that? I went, I have no idea. I don't know what that is. I've never thought about that before. I don't know. Right. So I'm willing to say, I don't know, and happy to say, I don't know when I don't know something. The issue is are there things that Christians should be able to know and explain that often we punt for mystery instead of seeking an explanation, right? So instead of diving deeply, so I just had this conversation with my brothers over the weekend, instead of diving deeply into the process of canonization, how did we get our Bibles? Why did people choose the books that they did? How do we understand what is authoritative and not is not, what is inspired, what is not? What is the process that this went through? What did the early councils do? Like, instead of really diving deeply into why certain books are there and others are not, we just go, well, I just believe the Bible is the word of God, end of story. And the question is, well, why is James included? Why not the Gospel of Peter? And we might just say, well, I don't know. And that's a true answer if someone doesn't know. But the question is, well, should we know? Now, I'm not saying every Christian has to study this topic and know all these answers, but the question is, if you've been challenged and you go, actually, I want to know that, and you then research and you find the reasoning for why James was chosen and the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas was not chosen, to then give an answer and say, hey, I actually do know this. I've looked into it. Here's an answer. That's not just an arrogant thing of I don't want to look dumb and admit I don't understand. It's saying I have studied this. I do want to understand. And not saying I'm smarter than atheists, but I've just considered these things and I want to present an alternative perspective. And so I think often you can find people that are not humble in doing apologetics. I remember talking to one youth leader when I was talking about the trips I lead with Maven, where we train students in Christian theology and apologetics, and then we take them out to Utah and college campuses around the country, where they engage with atheists and skeptics and Mormons and people that believe differently. And he asked me, how do you keep the students from becoming arrogant, from thinking, oh, I just have learned all the right answers and responses, and now I'm just going to prove you wrong? And I said, you're right. That is a possibility that someone can turn to that. That's why we often and very quickly and frequently remind them that there was a time when God was gracious on them, that we need to see people not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as the lost that need to be found, right? People that need to be forgiven. We need to, that causes us to engage differently, that we look at this as a way we're arguing with people, not with just ideas. It's like, hey, we want to see the person. That's why I always encourage asking questions. Tell me your story. Let me understand you. Why do you think this? What exactly do you think? You're addressing a person, not just an intellectual thing. And so there's a lot of ways in which we can become arrogant and just, I'm going to destroy this person, but that's not always the case. And I think there's ways to do it with humility to say, look, I could be wrong here. And I try to do that in our men's chapter. Like, hey, I could have missed his argument. I didn't see an argument against this. I could have missed it. Maybe it's there. I didn't see one. Here's what I think he did. If you saw it, point it out. If you've been following along and reading this book, point it out. And that's why I try to open myself up as well to people to call in and to ask questions and say, hey, look, if you have thought through things that I haven't thought through, bring it up. And I'm happy to say, I don't know. I just don't think it's not a way to look dumb. I think here's the way I would put it. Instead of saying, well, I just don't want to look dumb, and so I study all this stuff because I don't want to look dumb to atheists. It's atheists and others have real questions, and Christianity can provide real answers. And so rather than saying, I don't know to every good question an atheist asks, instead of saying, I don't know to every good objection an atheist asks, if we can actually study it and provide a reasonable answer, something to respond to, I think that is taking the Christian mission seriously when 2 Corinthians says that we are called to be ambassadors of Christ, that God is making his appeal through us. Can you imagine an ambassador of the United States that when they go to another country, that every time they're asked a question about the United States or how our country can help them or whatever, they say, well, I don't know. And you say, well, you just don't want to look dumb. And so you think about all the answers to their questions. Well, that's not just not wanting to look dumb. That's trying to do your job well. An ambassador should be able to go into another country and say, look, here's what we have. Here's how we can work together. Like, I understand your culture. I understand my culture. Here's how we can benefit each other. That's a good ambassador, not just someone who's trying to not look dumb. And so if that's what Scripture calls us as Christians to be ambassadors for Christ, that God is making his appeal through us, then I would say it's not just an attitude, prideful thing of not wanting to look dumb. It's trying to do my job well. It's trying to be a good ambassador. Someone who understands the thing I'm an ambassador for and understands the culture in which I'm an ambassador to, and trying to bring the gospel to that culture. So that's how I would respond. I hadn't really thought about it in that way before. It's a really good question, but that's kind of my response to that. And as Slam said, Christianity says to go out and make disciples. So we need to go out and talk to people. Here's another question, Homobu. Let me get something to drink here really quickly. Do you think that it's equally valid for a person who goes through an extreme hardship to lose faith in God? For example, no good God would have allowed childhood cancer. Well, I think the point here, and it's a good question. The point is, if someone goes through a hard time and loses faith in God, I wouldn't say that's any evidence against God. Just as if a person goes through a hard time and gains faith in God, that's not evidence for God, right? It just recognizes that we make certain choices in certain times. And so I'm not saying this is a reason for or not to believe in God. It's just a reality that hard times make us do certain things, make us make choices. Now, if you're going to say, well, no good God would have allowed childhood cancer, again, this is so difficult. But let's just say this. Why do things like this take place? Now, I have a whole sort of video series on this, but what are we expecting of God when we say no God would allow this? Right? I've used this example a million times. When my son was born, and even now as he's a little boy, a year and a half old, I take him to the doctor to get vaccinations. And he would probably think in his mind, no good father would allow childhood vaccinations, would allow this pain to be inflicted on me. Why would you allow this, Dad? And my response to my child is, you don't understand, right? This temporary pain is actually providing a benefit to you. Now, I'm not saying that all cancer is a benefit, but there is one way to respond to the problem of evil. And it's to simply say, look, as Paul said, I forget where in Corinthians, for this light and momentary affliction is producing in us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison as we look to not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. Paul recognized for these light and momentary afflictions were producing an eternal weight of glory. We recognize that suffering, as Romans says, suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and this hope does not disappoint. We recognize that difficulties do something in us, that build something in us. And so if God's goal is to actually build in us a lasting, flourishing life where we understand things, the question is a current life where everything is easy and the way and without any pain, hardship, or difficulty at all, is that actually produce the best life? And so one answer, I'm not saying this is true of all childhood cancer, but one answer to why does God allow evil is what's called the soul-making defense. That we only learn patience when we have to wait. But we don't ever understand the patience of God if we've never had to be patient ourselves and had to wait. We wouldn't understand the peace of God unless we've experienced chaos. We wouldn't understand the love of God unless we understand hate. We wouldn't understand the forgiveness of God and the death of Jesus on the cross if we've never had to forgive. We would never understand how difficult it is for Jesus to forgive us, in a sense, if we've never had the difficulty of forgiving. When we know how hard it is to forgive, we know how hard it is to lay down our lives for others. When we know how hard it is to do these things, then that is where we go, wow, Jesus, you're amazing. Right? The fact that Jesus gave up the riches and glory in heaven, took on human flesh, took on poverty so that we might be rich. When we understand what it means to be human and the difficulties and pains of humanity, then that is even more so to go, wow, God, you are so incredible. And so we recognize that through struggles and difficulties, we are actually growing in character. And I think in an understanding of God that gives it to us a deeper appreciation for God in the life to come, which is our eternal life. We also look at, why does God allow evil? We have to take heaven into consideration. Right now, if the Christian story is true, we're saying, okay, why does the Christian God allow for evil? Well, think about this. That child or anyone has horrible cancer, horrible pain during their life. They have 80 years of miserable existence here on life, and they die and go to an everlasting life with God in heaven, free of cancer, free of pain, free of any sort of sadness, and they live eternity with joy, happiness, and peace with God. 80-year suffering now, divided by an infinite happiness in heaven, is effectively, mathematically, suffering 0% of your existence. 80 divided by infinity is 0%. And so I think that's what Paul can be talking about with this light and momentary affliction. Not saying your suffering doesn't exist. It is absolutely real. It is horrible. It is miserable. But the question is, can it be used to produce something good? And ultimately, from God's perspective, how can he be good and let this happen? Well, he recognizes no matter how bad our suffering is, I think, in this life, if we live for eternity with Christ and him in heaven, that we're effectively suffering 0% of our life. We have to take heaven into account. We also have to recognize in another response to why does God allow evil, that what are we expecting God to do? That we want him to create a world that follows natural laws where there are lessons to be learned, but then nothing actually happens naturally, right? The same water that is necessary for life can cause people to drown. The same hard ground that is necessary for us to exist and for us to walk and farm and eat and do all the things that we do allows for people to fall and trip and stub their toes, right? Gravity that keeps us in existence causes sometimes people to fall to their death, right? All of these things happen naturally, allow for the possibility of harm. And so it's almost like we want God to create this world in which we can experience the joys of life, yet not have any of the possible side effects from any of those joys. So we want water to have life, but then not let anyone drown and those sort of things. And the question is that a real world or is that a cartoon world? And what would we actually learn from that world? And to say no good God would allow this, I would say, why not? If God is recognizing, I created this world, and it is good while it has the possibility of sin. And then humans have broken this. Remember, the result of sin and cancer and disease and all this in the world affecting us is because of a human problem, that we have corrupted this world, that Adam and Eve, through their rebellion against God, led to the corruption. And God is actually restoring and redeeming it and fixing it. And we recognize all of these things at play. And there's more responses we could look at. I think that we have a reason to say, yeah, God still can be good and allow this, just like I could be a good father and allow my son to suffer, because we recognize there's a reason for that suffering. And if we recognize, look, and I would say, hey, son, you don't understand. There's a reason I'm holding you down and letting doctors shove needles in your legs and your arms. You'll understand one day. If his lack of knowledge compared to my lack of knowledge is a right response to say, you just don't get it. One day you will. What is my lack of knowledge compared to an infinite God's knowledge? How big is that gap to where God could possibly say, look, I know you don't think I'm good because of this, but one day you will. You will understand why this took place. And again, I think the reality of cancer as well, and I've shared this story before, my professor for Why God Allows Evil, Dr. Clay Jones, went through a cancer treatment, and he's going through another cancer treatment right now. And he looks at cancer not as a say, God, how could you be good and allow this? Or you're not good because you allow it. He looks at his cancer to say, I'm not supposed to love this body, and I'm not supposed to love this life. And this pain that I experience reminds me of the futility of this life. It reminds me of that this is not what I'm created for. It reminds me to not love this life so much and to think that I'm in control. What we've been talking about in this show, you're not in control. You're not the author of your ship and the master of your life. You're not the one in charge. There's so much outside of your control that we often need others for help. And so I think there's many different ways to look at it. And so just because we go through hardship and God allowing people to have cancer doesn't mean that he's not good. Now, let's just say, for example, God does say, okay, fine, all childhood cancer gone. Now would we say, okay, God can be good? Well, no, because now we just find the next worst thing. Well, now we want no adult cancer, and then we want no this, and we want no this. And I think ultimately this is just a slippery slope to eventually what we want is just a world with no disease, no sickness, no dying, no death, no nothing. And that's the only possible way that we can be convinced that the good God exists. And the reality is that world is coming. And there's one hope, there's one truth, and there's one way to get there, and that is through faith in Jesus Christ. And so that is a world that is promised to us, yet often people go, no, I don't want to consider that, or I don't want to think about it, or I don't want to believe in that God. And so we miss out on that reality of that life that we all want for these sort of various reasons. So hopefully, hey, if you're here listening, then you are wanting to consider these things, but I think that's a reality of what is taking place. All right, let me continue to go through the questions that are here in the live chat. And again, if you want to call in, let's see, I'm not seeing other cues. So again, if you have a question, put a Q before it, because I see a lot of comments that have come in, but I don't know which ones are meant for me. All right, here's one that doesn't have a Q, but it looks like a question for me. Would you agree with most people converting to Christianity are not asking for evidence of its truth? Evangelism leaves that for years later when they already believe and have the lens of faith. I think evangelism happens in a lot of different ways. I think that there are people who have been led to Christianity because of the evidence. I have examples of this in my own life where because of me presenting an apologetic argument, people have come to faith. And so there's not an intentional, I want to sneak you in the door and get you to believe. And now that you've believed, I'm going to present all these bad arguments to make you think that there's reason to believe when there's really not. I think, again, that would be not the most favorable, charitable way to look at what's taking place here. There are absolutely people who have believed because of evidence. Then there are people who haven't believed because of evidence, but maybe it's a felt need. It's a reality. It's something else that they are experiencing, and here is a solution to their problem. And so, just like, you could, for example, someone has some sort of pain that they're dealing with, and a doctor says, I can fix you. And you go, okay, I trust you, doctor. And then you go to the doctor, and their pain is gone and they're fixed. And now they believe that doctor had the ability. Now, is that because of evidence? Is that because of some sort of argument presented? No, not necessarily. It's just a trust in that doctor. But the fact that the issue was dealt with, or the fact that things changed afterwards, led them to believe that it was actually true. Now, then we want to confirm it with other stuff as well, but that absolutely happens. And then there's other people where the doctor says, I can fix you. And it goes, okay, but how do I know that? What, based on what? What are you going to do? How does that work? And I want all the details. I want all the evidence. And that takes place as well. And so I think that, yes, many people come to believe for many different reasons. Sometimes evangelism waits to give evidence, and sometimes evidence is given right away. I just don't see how that is necessarily an argument against any sort of belief in Christianity, just because some people come to belief in different ways. The question is, well, what is their reason for belief? Is it irrational? Is it rational? And ultimately, is Christianity true? Phantom X says, I would say that Christianity relies on personal experience for its proof. Experience is an aspect of proof. Absolutely. Just like I know what I dreamt last night because I experienced that dream. And that's the proof that I have of that thing. And so there absolutely is a personal experience factor. The question is it only personal experience? And my argument would be no, right? If you watch like a William Lane Craig debate, he gives often 5 arguments for Christianity. He says, here's the cosmological argument. God exists based on the beginning of the universe. God exists based on the fine tuning of the universe. God exists because of objective moral values and duties. God exists because of the evidence of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And God exists because of an inner witness of the personal, inner witness of the Holy Spirit, a personal testimony of the Holy Spirit. And so that 3rd or 5th part is an experience of God, just like we experience things and we know things that are true because I experienced it. Like, what does fish taste like? Well, you know what it tastes like because you've experienced it. And so experience absolutely is a way to tell you something that's true. Now, can our experiences ever lead us wrong? Absolutely. Our experiences can lead us wrong. And so the question is it only experience? And at least what I've presented in my videos is that we have evidence and arguments in this series. We've talked about the beginning of the universe and fine-tuning of the universe and objective moral values and duties and the laws of logic and the existence of consciousness. And there's a lot of external, non-experiential reasons to believe in God. And therefore, there's evidence to support it. And then there's also an experience that people do have. Frank Tovey says, faith by definition is not based in reality. Okay, well, that would be your definition of faith then. That's not my definition of faith. And so if you are going to redefine what faith means and then discredit it, that would be the perfect example of a straw man fallacy, where you've taken a Christian, you've completely redefined what that Christian believes, you've changed what that Christian believes, and then you've knocked it over. Well, congratulations, that's your definition of faith, and you've knocked over a straw man. The issue is that's not my view of faith, and that's not a Christian view of faith. And so if you want to show that Christians do not follow facts, and that Christians do have some sort of blind, or you say that stupid people have faith, then you actually have to show how faith is by definition not based in reality. And you'd have to argue or interact with the evidence that I've actually presented. That's what I would say there about definition of faith. All right, let me continue to scan through. All right, Phantom X. Some Christians want to have a scientific explanation for everything in the Bible. Do you think that having that would diminish the role of faith has in Christianity? All right, so back to the question of faith. No, I don't. Now, I also don't think that there's a scientific explanation for everything in the Bible. I think the Bible is not necessarily written, it's not written as a science book. It's not written to give us all of these scientific truths about reality. It doesn't tell us about Jupiter and, and gravitational poles and all this kind of stuff. The Bible is written to tell us about God's story of redemption, creation, fall, redemption, restoration, God's plan in redeeming and restoring us as humanity. That's the purpose of the Bible. Now, are there times when the Bible overlaps with scientific things? Yes, creation is one, where the Bible talks about creation, and our science has its view of, or its evidence, its way of investigating what took place at the beginning of the universe and how advanced human life got here. And so that would be a way in which the Bible and science do overlap, and we need to consider that. And so I don't think that everything is in the Bible has a scientific explanation, but there are times that we can look to science to see how do we make sense of certain things in the Bible. Now, do I think that having that would diminish the role of faith? Absolutely not. Because faith, as I've talked about on the show before, is not blind faith. Now, atheists are going to disagree with me, and I see it over and over and over again. And you say, no, faith is blind. Okay, you're redefining faith, and you're applying a definition to me that I don't agree with. It would be the same of me saying an atheist is someone who denies the existence of God and says there is no God. And the atheist comes back and says, no, that's not atheism. Atheism is merely a lack of belief. And I say, nope, that's not what it is. Atheist means there is no belief, and you should have evidence. Where's your evidence that there is no God? And they're like, well, I don't need evidence that there is no God because I don't say that there is no God. I simply lack a belief in God. And I go, nope, that's not fair. Atheism is there is no God. Like, you would be like, Ryan, you're being ridiculous. And that's true, because if I'm going to be talking to someone and I say, this is what atheism means, it means there is no God. And that person responds and goes, okay, that's not my view though. I do call myself an atheist, but for me, that means I simply lack a belief in God. Now, to be charitable and respectful, I now need to engage with their definition and go, okay, that's how you consider atheism. That's what it means when you call yourself an atheist. Now let me engage with that. And the same thing is happening here. My definition of faith that I think is from Scripture and I can defend biblically is that faith is trusting in the evidence. Faith is trusting in the things that we have good reason to believe are true. And so then to come back and say, nope, 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 faith is blind, therefore you have a blind faith, I would say, okay, well, you're not engaging with me. Just like if I kept saying, no, 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 atheism means there is no God, you would say, well, you're not engaging with me. That's not my view. And so what I'm asking is for us to be charitable, to be respectful, and to allow someone to recognize how they are understanding and defining words. Now, if you want to talk about whether that's an appropriate definition or not, by all means, go ahead and do that. But you can't just claim for me that my belief, as what was previously commented, is blind, is baseless, therefore I have a baseless belief. And so I would define faith as believing in that which we have good reason to believe is true, trusting in things we have good reason to believe is true, trusting in the evidence, right? Again, a simple explanation. There's a lot of different ways that we can look at this, but a simple point here, if I can pull it up, is in Hebrews chapter 1. If my Bible app will load. Hebrews chapter 1, right there at the beginning. Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews 11:1. Faith is the reality of things hoped for, the proof of what is not seen. right? And so we recognize, yes, there's an aspect of not seen because it's a future event, but it is a reality or the proof of that thing. And so it is not the opposite of evidence, but it is because of the evidence. Yeah, we don't see it, but is there proof for it? Is there good reason to trust it? Now, that's just one quick example. So therefore, Phantom X, to your question, do you think having that scientific explanation would diminish the role of faith in Christianity? And the answer for me would be by no means. Because having scientific explanations is what gives us the evidence or the assurance of things unseen to when we go, okay, now I trust that this is the right thing. I may not have seen it, but I trust it based on the evidence. And so that is the way that I would look at Christianity. And so I don't see evidence as being contrary to faith. All right, continuing on. Phantom X again. Couldn't God have created us with those memories that shaped our character, but not actually made us go through the difficulties? The question is there actually a value of going through things? Is there a value of living life? And also, is there a value of trusting God? Atheists often push back against a Christian view of what about free will? What about the freedom of belief? What about the ability to choose what I want to do and not being forced? For God to force people to believe things would be ridiculous. At the same time, I often get the objection, and I'm not saying this one is it, but it's similar, saying, well, why didn't God just create us all in heaven with these memories and so that we can enjoy heaven? And it's like saying, well, we then want God to create us in a world in which we could not have done otherwise. Rather, God creates us in this life, gives us legitimate freedom to choose, and allows us to choose whether we want him or whether we don't want him. And so this freedom is what allows for us to have a genuine, loving relationship. It's like, I'm going to create, I'm going to create Alexa, I'm going to create Siri, and I'm going to give her, I'm going to implant in her a bunch of memories of a childhood that she never had so that she can learn how to make good decisions. So that she makes the right decisions moving forward. Well, that's what we call programming, where you put in a bunch of backfill stuff to allow apps and programs to then spit out correct information when certain situations take place. But there's no freedom in that. There's no intentionality in that. There's no love in that. And so when I program Alexa when I say, do you love me? And she says, yes, it's like, does that feel good? It's like, well, no, because she doesn't actually love me. She's just programmed to do that. And so I think that God, rather than just programming us with certain memories and experiences to get us to do certain things, that is now controlling us, which is the very thing that most people object to God, and that he is just controlling us. And then why doesn't he just let us be free to make our choices? And I would say that's right. God is giving us freedom. He's giving us a life to where we can learn from our own choices. We can learn from our mistakes. We have genuine human freedom. We have genuine human thought. And that then he trusts us to use that well, to make right choices versus wrong choices. And when we make wrong choices, there are consequences. But he gives us that freedom to learn from those mistakes rather than controlling us at every moment, forcing us to do what he wants us to do, which I think is the big objection against God, if he is a controlling God. And so I think that he is doing the very thing that many people want him to do and give them freedom and let them make their own choices. Yet often when we do that, we then push back and say, well, actually, we would want a God that programs us and that controls us and that doesn't let us do evil. And so my question is, okay, what do we want? What does Scripture show to be true, and what is actually better? And I think the way that God has done it is actually best. All right, next question. Would you rather learn about pain, suffering, and patience, or would you rather your kids not die from cancer? That's a weird question. I would rather no one dies. I would rather no one gets sick. I would rather no issues ever happen. The question is, or the reality is, that what I would want to happen doesn't mean this is what happens. And also what I would want to happen isn't necessarily what's best to happen, right? There's just a reality that we know, like, man, wouldn't it be nice? I would want to just have $1 million dropped in my bank account. And then you ask most people, would that be good for me if $1 million was just dropped in my bank account? I don't think so, right? Now you're gonna say, well, that's not the same as dying from cancer. Of course not. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, look, my wants, my desires are shaped by my very limited understanding. Talk about, I am very limited. I don't know very much. And so my desires of what I think would be best are shaped only by what I know, which is very, very small. And so for me to say, I think I know better than God, I think I know what's best, and here's what would be best for humanity, is claiming that I know more than the one who knows everything. To claim that I know better than the one who knows best. And that is prideful. It's interesting that the question came in saying Christians are claiming to be prideful, or maybe is it a prideful reason that Christian apologists are claiming to know these things? When in reality, a Christian often says, I don't know why people die of cancer. I don't know why these happen, but I trust God because he does know best. And an atheist often come along and say, well, here's what would be better, as if they know what's better than the one who knows best. Right? Again, this is presupposing that Christianity is true, but that's the whole point, is in a Christian view, if God really does exist, wouldn't this be better? How would I know? We are limited. We are emotional. We make decisions that we don't quite know for sure based on what we have experienced. And that often points us to truth, and that often points us to things that are not true. And so I think that we need to take an appropriate position in recognizing if Christianity is true, there is a God who is all loving, all powerful, all knowing, who is controlling all. And so is there not a reality then to say, I may not know, but let me trust him, just like with children, where my son, at times I want him to say, I may not know why dad is saying, like my kid, he wants to watch movies all the time. And we say, no, you're not going to get movies all the time. You're just going to watch movies every day, all day. Why not? I want to watch a movie. He doesn't understand how just that would ruin him. How too much screen time is not good for him. Just watch movies all day long is not actually a good thing. He doesn't get that. In a sense, I'm saying, look, you don't understand, but trust me. Right? You know I love you. You know I care about you. You know what I want is best for you, or you know I want the best for you. So I need you to trust me in this, even though you may not understand. And as he grows up, he may understand, yeah, that's not best to just watch movies all day, every day. And then he may recognize, oh, dad knew what he's talking about. Now, if that can be true of me as a limited, fallen, mistaken-prone human being, what can we say is true about God? Could there not possibly be the same that is true? We're a God that is all loving, all powerful, all good, compassionate, generous, gracious with us. And it says, trust me. You will understand one day. Maybe you will now, maybe you will in 5 years, maybe you never will in this life, but trust me. And we go, nope, I know what's better. I think that by nature is more prideful and more arrogant to claim that we know better than the God who knows best. And so, sure, I would rather no one suffer. I would rather there be no pain. But is that actually a better world when we know for a fact that, as we talked about, that pain is God's megaphone to a broken world, that pain is actually what leads us to repentance. It's these sort of things that make people recognize their need for God. And that's a true reality, that when everything is amazing and going well, that we go, we got this. We don't need God for it. And I think that's a reality of my studies in technology. And someone asked me this question last night. And it's the more we are able to control everything using technology, the more we think that we're in control of everything. And then we push God out of the way and say, see, no need for God. We have closed every single gap and we are good. We're on our own. And I think this is by nature the opposite of a humble sacrifice or submission to God and saying, God, I need you. It's saying, no, I got this. I don't need anyone's help. I can do this on my own. Through technology, we can fix all of our problems. And I know what's best. And I think that, I don't know, it may not be a satisfying answer. And again, it's not satisfying. There are difficult truths about reality that we have to cope with. And just because a truth is difficult does not mean it's false, right? If a doctor comes to someone and says, you have cancer, that's a difficult truth. That doesn't mean it's false. We don't just always choose the answer that is easier to wrap our minds around or that is more satisfying. We sometimes have to wrap our minds around some really, really hard truths. And this is a difficult one. Sure, would I want a world in which there's no pain or suffering and no one dies young? Absolutely. That is a horrible tragedy. Yet that is a tragedy that Scripture says is a result of our sin and our brokenness and our fallenness that God has come to redeem and restore. And so that Christianity provides a solution to it. Christianity provides hope and an answer to it. Here's my question. What does atheism provide? Like, please hear me on this one. I think this is an interesting question. I would love your thoughts and pushback, all the atheists listening. If we're going to say there is no God because of evil, pain, and suffering in the world, because of this pain and disease and suffering in the world, there is no God. have we fixed the problem? What hope do you now have? What solution now is there? Now all it's like, well, life sucks. End of story. That's it. Like, we haven't removed the problem of evil, pain, and suffering. We haven't removed child cancer by denying God. The only thing that turning to atheism provides, or the only thing that atheism gives you or does for you, is simply removes the solution. It removes the ultimate hope that there is one who loves us, that has sent his son, Jesus Christ, to die and rise from the dead to overcome death and disease and brokenness and restore all things once and for all. All you've done is remove the solution. You have not actually fixed the problem. There's still death, disease, dying, and child cancer in a world that there is no God, if God does not exist. And so what actually is the hope there? Now the atheist, it's like, okay, now there's pain, suffering, and children dying of cancer. What now? And you go, well, that sucks. That's just the way life is. End of story. The Christian says, yeah, that's the way life is, but there's hope because God is good and because he loves us. I think we have a very different story to tell. All right, let me continue scanning through the questions. What would it take for you to believe God is not all good? Well, I think ultimately there is the fact that there is goodness, the fact that there is objective right and wrong points to an objective moral lawgiver, ultimately God's nature, who is good. And so there's a lot of arguments from an evil God hypothesis. Because of so much evil in the world, therefore God must be evil, and sometimes he allows for there to be good. I don't think that these arguments go through. I think you would almost have to be in I would say, what would it take for me to believe that there is not, that God is not all good? It would almost have to be this kind of nihilistic world in which there is no goodness, and which everything is purely subjective, on which nothing ultimately matters, and where we just do whatever we want to do, or we believe what we want to believe, or there is no objective rightness and wrongness. I think the fact that there is an objective good points to a transcendent good above. And so to convince me that there is no good God would have to be that there is no goodness that then flows from that good God. And therefore we'd live in some sort of nihilism in which there is no ultimate meaning, hope, value, or goodness. So I don't know if there's a longer answer that I could provide. I'd have to think more about that. That's a good question. All right. Scanning. Again, if you want to call in, I left the link there. I don't think. Oh, thanks for speaking at Mission. Much appreciated. You're welcome. Glad I could. Again, I see a lot of you guys talking to each other, which is great. Looking for more questions. Let's see. I'm not seeing other questions. All right, here's a question. Is there anything more important to you than your children? If not, then how can you possibly say that them dying is worth something more important? So that's an interesting way to phrase it. So one, is there anything more important? God is. God is the most important being. And I think I want to place my relationship in him above all else. And it's because of that, right? This is what, someone brought up once of like, the Bible says that we need to be horrible people, like hating our family to follow God. That's not what the Bible is saying. The Bible is saying, are you willing to put following Christ above everything else? Are you willing to say this is the most important thing, is to follow Christ? And then I think when you recognize what it means to follow Christ, and that following Christ is an example for how we are called to live, where it says, hey, love your wife as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, then that then leads me to be a better husband and a better father, and because of the example of Jesus in my life. And so I would say that, no, my children are not the most important thing. I think my relationship with God is more important. Now, my children are incredibly important, but here's the question. what do I want it's not that something is more important. The question is, this just sounds horrible to say because you're asking something slightly different. So let me take a step back. Do good parents ever allow pain in a child's life? And the question is, well, if your children are the most important thing to you, wouldn't you want everything to be easy and perfect and never have experiencing any pain or suffering? And the answer is no. We constantly allow for the possibility of pain in our children's lives for their benefit so that they grow, right? We don't just lock our children into a little bubble padded room so that they never get sick or possibly stub their toe or do anything bad. We often intentionally inflict pain on children's lives, like giving them vaccines for a better purpose. And so the question here is, if you love your children, if they're one of the most important things to you, why would you ever let anything bad possibly happen to them? And the answer is, well, we do this all the time for their benefit, for their growth, because we want them to grow and mature as adults and be able to survive on their own. And that means making some choices and learning the consequences of choices. And this is just a normal parenting thing of you just don't do everything for your child. Now, what about them dying? I want to do everything I possibly can to keep my children from dying. Let me just be clear about that. I will lay my life down for my kids so that they may live. But the matter of the fact is that we don't control everything that happens to us, and we can't do everything. And so again, for me to lock my children into a padded, sterile room so that they never have the possibility of dying, you would throw me in jail for being an evil, corrupt parent. If I go, no, my children are most important to me, I don't want anything bad to ever happen to them, you would go, the mere fact that you lock them in a padded room is a bad thing that's happening to them. You have to allow them to experience life. And with that comes the possibility of getting hurt or possibly even dying, for which you have no control over. And so there's a trust in God. And there's a constant prayer every single day. God, I want to do what is best and I want to protect my children, but I trust their lives in your hands because ultimately I can't. And I'm not in control of every little factor that may get them. My child may get cancer and I have no control over that, but I guarantee you if they do, I will fight with every ounce in my body to do everything in my power to find healing and a cure for that. And so that's what we do for what is most important. The reality that we have to face is that death is out of our hands in most cases. And so the question is, do we trust God? Do we actually recognize a true hope in the midst of death? Or do we deny God's goodness because of our child getting sick and say, therefore, there is no God, and children still get sick and die of cancer, and now you've only lost hope? And that to me is not a better solution. And if you're going to say, and if anyone's going to claim like, well, you just believe now because you want this crutch, God's just a crutch to you. Well, in reality, God is a crutch. We have to recognize we need help. Just like a doctor, I need help. I can't fix myself. I can't cure this disease on my own. I need help. It's a recognition of our own brokenness and a true recognition of the one who actually has the power to save and the power to heal and the power to forgive. I can't do it all on my own. But I'm not just simply doing it out of emotional reasons. There's a reality. If you watch, I've got hundreds of videos on YouTube providing evidence and reason and argument for Christianity. Now, you may not be persuaded by those arguments. And an atheist that you might be talking to, Christian, may not be persuaded by those arguments. They may not think the evidence is good evidence, but that doesn't mean there's no evidence or no arguments involved at all. And I think it is, very, as Armin talks about here, that it is patronizing to claim that atheists will just become Christian when their life crumbles. I think it's patronizing to keep telling Christians, well, there's no evidence when they provide evidence. There's a difference between there being no evidence and you're thinking the evidence is not good or not persuasive. And I think that's the reality that we're talking about here. So, I want to say the most important thing in my child's life is for them to know Christ too, and for them to understand what he has done for them. That's what I think is most important. All right, continuing on, looking for questions. Again, if you want to call in, I have about, 2 minutes left. So I guess we might have to end. I got 2 minutes. Quickly go through if there's any last questions. What about Hindu or Muslim children who die of childhood cancer before accountability? I think that everyone before the age of accountability goes to heaven. I think that any child anywhere before the age of accountability, before the age of moral responsibility, I think that they are saved, because you cannot hold them morally responsible for actions that they never did, or wrong that they should have known otherwise when they couldn't have known otherwise. And so I think that anyone who dies before that age is accountable. Anyone after the age of accountability now is accountable for their actions and their knowledge of God and how they respond to God. And God has revealed himself to all people, as Romans 1 says. All right, scanning quickly again, scan, looking. All right, that's the end of the questions. So thank you for being here. Again, hopefully sometime in December, I will be able to reschedule my interview with Dr. Fuz Rana on the scientific case for human origins of Adam and Eve. Until then, I have 2 chapters left in this book by Armin Navabi. The last 2 chapters are, let me pull it up here. Chapter 19, smart people and renowned scientists like X, Y, and Z believe in God, so it must be true. And then chapter 17, how can we really know anything? And so that is the questions, last 2 parts that we have here. That's going to be the next 2 weeks that we're going to look at, as well as hopefully squeezing in that last interview before the end of the year. So thank you for being here. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for your interaction. It's always encouraging, and it's always, I think, beneficial for everyone to hear pushback and arguments and questions about the Christian faith, and not just hear me talking to myself all the time. So again, a lot of other videos are going to pop up over here on the side on YouTube to help you continue to think well about the Christian faith and about culture. And until next week, have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Enjoy that time, and then hopefully you get some rest and find things to be thankful to God for, and recognizing that thankfulness is always to someone. Who are we showing our thankfulness to? And recognizing again that we are not in control, that we are not the ones in power over all, and that we rely on other people and ultimately God for everything. And so how do we have that proper humility and thankfulness for what we've been given? So have a wonderful Thanksgiving week, and I will see you again next week with part 19 of this series on the scientific smart people don't believe in God, therefore he must be true. Till then, continue to think deeply about God, Christianity, and Jesus, because they are worth thinking about. Bye, everybody. Have a good one.